Hey traders, this is Christian from Tribeca Trade Group with your weekend video. So in the weekend video, what I normally talk about is a little bit of the indices. I talk a little bit about sectors and where there's some strength, and talk about a couple different areas globally that I think have some relative strength or a nice setup for a swing trade, and then what I like to talk about is single stocks and some of the option flow that we've seen. So I'll start here with the S&P. Really, not much has changed from last week. The S&P was up about 20 basis points for the week. International markets did much better last week, and I'll just kind of go over a little bit of the performance. If you look at the international performers last week, one thing to note, and I just put this on Twitter. I've got 39 different names in my international watch list, both single countries as well as regions. But the bottom line is, I think there was only 3 out of the 39 that were negative, and it was really only Mexico. These other areas were basically just, I would chalk them up as flat. But you could see, the alpha in this market continues to be things outside of the U.S. So certainly, of course, in the U.S., there's been some great areas, and but we focus on them, and the financial media focuses on them just all the time, and they get very little attention. So just for the week, when something where SPY was basically flat for the week, you could see that I've got a list here of, I think it's 12 different names that were over, basically 2% and over last week. So again, there's a lot of really interesting things going on outside of the U.S. borders in terms of investments. And that's what I cover at Tribeca Trade Group. I cover whatever's moving, right? So if it's international areas, I'm going to cover more and spend more time about that. Or if it's just in the U.S., then I'm going to spend more time on that. But this has been the theme all year long, regardless of what the financial media wants to focus on. It's international markets have really been outperforming, especially the emerging markets. So that was last week in international. In the U.S., steel names, semiconductors continue to outperform. I'm going to talk a little bit about those in a minute. Robotics every week seems to outperform. Solar also in there. The Chinese internet's quietly had a nice up week of 1.7%. Retail really got smoked last week, down 4%. This retail, by the way, failed where it needed to kind of change the trend right at the 200-day moving average. Really bearish looking move there on the 200-day moving average. Little consolidation here, and then down you go in retail. So that was the worst performing sector. And then the banks also took a breather last week with a lot of the names that reported earnings have, ran into earnings decently and then fizzled thereafter, which is often the case that we've seen, especially this year in earnings. A lot of names will run into earnings, then they have their earnings report, which is, I think for the most part, the banks, they kind of came out as expected. They talked about declines in trading revenues, which I think was priced in. I think a lot of people knew about that, and then some other areas of their business that are showing some improvements. But I think they just ran up too much into them, and I didn't really play. I didn't. I shouldn't say I didn't really. I didn't play any of the banks for earnings last week. I just didn't think that there was any edge there, and that proved to be correct. All right, so I mentioned not much has really changed from last week. This is very similar to the week before. We really didn't move at all last week. If you were on vacation last week, I mean, let's face it, my P&L was basically flat for the week. There was some things that moved, but there was a lot of things that didn't. And when I say my P&L, my option P&L, my cash trend portfolio continues to outperform. I am now up, decently outperforming the S&P since the inception of that portfolio. I'm up over 4% versus the S&P. So nice outperformance there. But if you traded options last week, there really wasn't much to do. And I don't know a lot of people who had huge performance. I recognize that some people may have done better than I have, but I think it was a tough week to trade last week. There was some good signals and things, but for the most part, if you had a portfolio of names on, which I kind of do for options, it really wasn't. There wasn't a lot to. There were not big moves. So S&P was fine. One thing that I noticed was that last week, and I put this in the newsletter this weekend, is that the S&P didn't even move greater than 30 basis points. So the VIX is, I know a lot of people criticize the VIX, but it's pricing in what it should be. When we're not moving more than 30 basis points, the VIX should be low. So to see it at 961 makes sense considering when you look at how much this overall, again, it just measures the S&P. It doesn't measure everything else outside of the S&P. It just measures what the S&P and how much it's moving. And when we don't move more than 30 basis points on any day of a week, it's doing what it should be doing, and pricing in really low, short-term volatility, which is what we've had. I mean, even if you go back the last couple weeks, we haven't had a day over. We had one day where we went up 60 basis points, which was a Thursday ago. But before that, it was the same thing. So we're not, the market isn't pricing in short-term volatility, nor is it, and it's doing a good job because aren't we aren't moving the overall index. I would expect more of this. Again, I try not to really make predictions, but we have seen this before going into earnings season where we basically just chop around because some names are going to move up, some names are going to move down. That's my big takeaway from that. We put on some trades, so while I think the overall markets are overbought and are really priced to perfection, I think that if we have some bad news coming out, maybe in earnings or something else that we don't know about, I think we will have a decent dip, but that remains to be seen. What I did last week was kind of think about names that that have not really run yet, that could possibly can possibly run, and I put together a few different trades: Apple, Amazon, ATVI, Google, and it's Activision, Blizzard, and Nvidia. And so far, the 3 out of the 5 have been basically home runs. The one name that's a loser is ATVI, which still has a chance to work because they don't report earnings for a couple weeks. And so far, Apple hasn't done anything yet. It's basically flat. So that's kind of what I'm looking at for names that I think to kind of position. And I think that's really what I'm going to be focused on is looking at names that could possibly run into earnings, just like I mentioned with the banks, that may not do anything at all for earnings because they may have made that run. So that's the way I'm kind of positioning myself in a couple of these trade ideas that I put out. And then, I have in here a lot of times I will talk. I'll be a little bit negative about the market, even though this market's been great this year. So it's not so much being negative. It's just I try to be very cognizant of risks. I'm always concerned about, which I think the great traders are, they're more concerned about risk and where you could lose money versus where you can gain. I think some beginning traders they always want to know, like, oh, how much can I make? How much, what am I going to make this year? I think to be an active trader, you always want to worry about where you could get stung in this market. So one thing that I see is an area that's been on fire all year long. The semiconductors, SMH is up 35%. I talked about this in one of my videos last week, towards the end of I think on Thursday I talked about it, how it's really overbought. So take a look at how much the price, these two moving averages that I have on my chart is the short-term moving averages. One is the yellow is the 5, the blue is the 20. Look at how far the price is above the 20. So it's, if you're riding the trend, so be it, or riding the wave, I should say. But keep in mind, every time this RSI has gotten to be around like 75, there's been a pretty big sting that, speaking of, I'll use that term again, there's been a pretty big red bar. Now, is that to say that, like, it's game over for the semiconductors because they're so overbought? No, I just think, you want to be taking profits here. If you're still long some semiconductors, which I am in my portfolio, I'm long a couple names. But what I did is I hedged it. I put on an SMH put trade for November because I think we're just way overbought. I don't know what could cause us to go down. I could come up with a couple ideas about what could cause us to go down, but certainly we've seen this before. When we get overbought, look at this red candle that happened here. Look at the one that happened here when we were overbought. Look at the one that happened here when we were overbought. So this has been the RSI has been a great roadmap for the SMH ETF. So I think it's a great place to take profits and possibly wait for a pullback, because The moral of this, or the conclusion of this, is every time we've gotten a pullback, this one took a little bit longer to get through, but every time we've gotten this type of pullback in the semiconductor ETF, it's been a great place to buy. So that's what I think is really the point that I want to stress here is that A, we're overbought, and B, if we do get a dip, it will probably be another good place to buy. I'm not going to go over sectors. That's in my newsletter. We already went about over performance. Uh, I'll just touch about ETF flows for last week. I'm not going to go into the individual names. You have to be a subscriber for that. But the materials saw a really big inflow last week. That's 2 straight weeks of inflows going into the material sector. Some gold miners in there. And then in international markets, emerging markets, which were up 2.2%, this has been all year long that the money has just been pouring into international markets, both developed and emerging. Fixed income. One thing that I would say, noteworthy, or something that I picked up on, something that I really haven't seen all year long, is a lot of money being taken off the sidelines. So we did see a little bit of that last week. Again, it's not huge, but BSV, SHY, SHV, these are all cash equivalent ETFs. They did see an uptick in inflows. So uh, BSV actually saw the biggest inflow of any fixed income ETF last week, $327 million, and then a couple of those other ones shy, 236 million in SHV. So it's a decent chunk of change that adds up to be over $500 million that went basically to the sidelines. So with the equity markets overbought, that makes perfect sense to me. A couple names I'm just going to go into here briefly. A couple names that I have my eye on. The solar ETF, really nice bounce. I talked about that last week in the trading room. I thought this had a chance to bounce on the 50-day moving average. It did just that. It was up 2% last week. So I think there's a bigger trade here. This is the break of the 200-day moving average. The price getting above here a few months ago, and it's in an uptrend. And take a look at what's kind of a longer term chart in TAN, and you can see that this was once like a $48 ETF. Now is $22. So I think you want to stick with this trend above the 200-day moving average. I like being long versus this 50-day, the purple line. I've talked about this one a couple times. ARKW. This is an ETF that probably off people's radar screen. This is an actively managed ETF. It's a very high momentum ETF, but some different names in here. You've got your Amazon and your Twitter, Netflix is in here, but you also have a couple other names in here that are a little bit different. So I like this ETF. I think it has different some exposure to different names, and if you're in a lot of momentum names. Sometimes people get to have too many of these names in their portfolio, so when there's a pullback, it could hurt. Or if something happens in one of these individual names, it could hurt a little bit. So having the ETF, which continues to see inflows, you can see these green bars here are the inflows. I like this, and I think into the 50-day moving average. So a pullback. This is wrong. Sorry. Um, that is a typo, which I make a lot of. Turkey is a name that I got long last week on the bounce of the 200-day moving average. So the yellow line is the 200-day moving average. I got long, I think, on this. I think it was Tuesday I got long on. So I'm up 2.4% since I added that to the portfolio. ASHR, this was something that I detailed last week. Saw some not inflows, saw a nice call buyer going out to January. And then DXJ, I talked about how there's been some call buying right around the all-time high of this ETF. So some pretty interesting stuff going on. They even put on a call fly, which that middle strike is right around that high of $59. So pretty interesting there. All right, so single stock names to watch, and I'm going to go over these kind of quickly. But ARNC, this is a name that I'm long. Arconic. There was a rumor about this name as well. There was some chatter, but they came in a couple times into Arconic. Some rumors about maybe somebody taking them over, which sometimes isn't the best when you know what it is, what the rumor is. But I'm going to stay long this because they've been continuing to come after it. So again, you're going to see this a couple times on the list. So this is starting from last week. Caesars, don't really know what's up in Caesars. I know they've had a lot of debt restructuring, but we've seen a lot of calls that are being traded out in January. So see, this has worked before when there's been call flow, but it almost seems like there's just a ton of it. And these are in the money calls that went up. So it is on a dip. Support is 1185 in Caesars that I think a long is worth. Again, the name is in an uptrend now. Marriott and Hilton, two of the lodging names. Really, you could pick any names that you want, but I would probably stick with the names that we're seeing option activity. Why I say that you could pick any names, because I did put together a lodging index because there's no ETF that's that specific to the hotels. But take a look at this ETF. This is all this is all the hotel names. I mean, 52-week high, and look at that trend. I mean, we briefly had a dip back here in the beginning of August around hurricane season, and since then they've been bought, and they're up to they're up to a 52-week high. So again, looking at this ETF, if you want to see the components that I've put together, this is an equally weighted ETF that I set up. Where is the there should be, I can't find it here, but yeah, so here's the, there should be a weighting screen. Here we go, weightings mode. You can see it's pretty much equally weighted. No name has over, what, 12% weight, but it's you could see what names are in here. Hilton and Marriott are both in there, as well as ILG, which also continues to see call buying. A couple other names I mentioned, Arconic Ready. You could see that there was repeat activity a couple times last week. ASHR, I already detailed that one. Wendy's saw call buying a couple weeks ago. So this is a restaurant name, and some of these restaurant names are starting to pick up a little bit. CMG went over the 50-day moving average. Big day on Friday. McDonald's continues to move higher. So if you're looking for a name that really hasn't participated that much, it's maybe Wendy's. I would wait to see if this name can get over the top of value. 1569 is the resistance, but they've come in now a couple times in Wendy's. So again, this was a couple weeks ago we saw call buying, and then recently, I think this was Wednesday, we saw another November 16 call buyer come in. Broadcom, I've been long this name, AVGO. This is really started to work. I was able to take a couple targets in this thing. I got long in here, and it's managed to get up. It did hit a little bit of resistance. It needs to get above 251.50. So I'm sitting long. I've taken, I think, one or two price targets in this one, and I'm looking for a breakout in Broadcom. And I like the fact that they keep coming back into this one. Caesars, we mentioned that one already. Let's keep things simple here, and we don't have to go that far off the radar with names. Amazon. So I mentioned I have a long Amazon trade for run into earnings, and I think a lot of people do this. They compare the Amazon and the Google and Amazon and Google charts. Google has been tremendous the last 2 weeks and has had the nice run up back to the previous high. I think Amazon could have the possibility to do that as well. So I've positioned myself long in Amazon as well, and I detailed the trade call spread. Again, they report earnings on the 26th, so a couple weeks for Amazon. Zoetis, this is an animal healthcare name, something a little bit different. Small call buyer in this one, but just got my attention last week. Nice MACD crossover here, and a move up to the last couple days. Also, IDXX is another name. This name did not see option activity, but also looks interesting here as well, as it's been kind of resting on the 200-day moving average. A couple other names. GBT, this is a, I would say, speculative biotech name. Big call buyer going out to March. That's a name that I'm already long. So it's great to see all these guys on Twitter talking about, oh my God, there was GBT calls, big call buyer. And then they like to say 20 times, 20 times average volume for options. So I've been long this name for the last couple weeks. Our job at Tribeca Trade Group is to get long some names before you see the option activity. That's really the whole name of the game for me. It's great sometimes names haven't moved, but I like to get in front of the option activity and kind of notice these setups, before we see the momentum stuff. On Friday, there was a couple interesting trades. You can see how many of these things that I've got labeled here. Lit, this is a name that I've been in. This is great. Again, a great example of seeing option activity in a name that I'm already long. So this is the lithium ETF. Look at all the inflows that this thing has been having. It kind of got a little bit ahead of itself here. I bought the dip into here, and since then I've been up nicely in this trade. It needs to break out of the 52-week highs, but I like that someone is positioning themselves. Looks like November calls is what they did here. JD.com, this name hasn't worked yet, but they continue to go after this thing. A lot of short dated calls. So like next week's calls, the week after that calls have been going up in JD.com. It has not broken the 200-day moving average, but it just has caused a lot of people some frustration because we keep seeing call buying almost every day in this thing, and every day that the name is down, usually call buyers happen. So I think this thing catches. It has been underperforming. If you look at the whole KWEB ETF, this is the Chinese Internet ETF, which JD is a part of. JD has really been underperforming, so maybe this name starts to catch up to the group. I am long JD.com. IGT, another name that every time there's been a dip the last couple of weeks has been a great place to buy. Whoops, that's lit. So it has dipped here a little bit from when we saw all this crazy call buying. We saw all the call buying starting in here, but it's been maintained. It's been quiet for the last week and a half until we saw a small call buyer on Friday. So that's that. EWJ, I talked about DXJ. It's kind of the same thing, but this one does have currency exposure. A couple other names. One that worked out very well for us was on Friday was HUN, Huntsman. This name is breaking out. So 52-week high on Friday, was able to take part of that trade off, and I'm remaining long that trade, and we'll see what it does here on this 52-week breakout. One other name, Philip Morris had calls, but they do report earnings this week. Not Philip Morris, Altria. And then also RFP, which is a lumber name or a paper name. Also saw call buying and a big move up in that name. So I'm going to leave it there for this week's video. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you in the trading room on Monday. Again, if like I said, I think in last week's video, if you're interested in checking out our trading room and the analysis that we do, such as this video, this is what we do all day long. And if you're serious about trading, you could go ahead and get a free trial to Tribeca Trade Group. You could just email me. My email address is cfromhertz@gmail.com, FROMHERTZ. I look forward to your mail and providing you with a free trial. So thanks for watching and enjoy your weekend. Thanks.